Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. Well then, this one is probably one of the ones that I've seen most requested in the book group as far as being a topic that should be covered on this podcast. And seeing as this is still getting started, and I'm hoping that these episodes will be useful not just in the moment as they're being released, but also as something that people can pass on for all time, that this is something to really jump into. So here it is. Anti-Fascist Heathenry. And what this is going to get into is all of what I think is an anti-fascist perspective on heathen practice, on what this is, why it is important to emphasize an anti-fascist, anti-racist perspective in contrast to the more broader concepts like universalism and inclusivity, as well as a lot of other things that are underpinning in that and what that implies. So we'll just get right into it then, because I know that this is probably going to be one that will get me quite a bit of hate mail and hopefully at least some positive comments, because if nothing else, we need something to drown the various fascist pricks who are out there in an absolute wall of sound. Because that is, as we'll get into, the only thing, at least one of the only things, that has ever worked for building communities that are truly solidly rooted in a genuine commitment to hospitality, to all who seek the wisdom and guidance and whatever else a particular spiritual community can offer. So just to give you all a quick breakdown so you know what is coming up and where this episode is going to go, the first place I'm going to kick this off with is the whole thing about religion and politics, because inevitably any of these discussions around inclusivity, diversity, confronting racism, and fascism, and these are two distinct but related things, and I think it's important to call both of these things out. As well as really any kind of situation where any spiritual practice is grappling with the problems and controversies that exist in the present day and confront our communities by the simple fact of that we live in this world and we are influenced by what is happening in the world around us. The next place that I'll get into is the whole question of white nationalism and the heathen revival, as to how this all happened in the first place, where this comes from, and also highlighting some important tensions within the global movement on this subject. Because there is this notion that heathenry is somehow inherently a more racist form of paganism than other forms of practice that are out there, which is something that, in my experience, I think is the more and more I see things coming to light in the broader pagan community, the more I'm seeing controversies, particularly around things like transgender rights, as well as just basic debates around racism and inclusion, that really the big distinction between what we see in heathenry and broader paganism is one of organization and concentration, as opposed to one of that heathenry is somehow uniquely more racist than other forms of pagan practice that all, let's be real, predominantly started in very white places, and as a result do carry a lot of baggage, much of which hasn't really been properly disposed of. So I'll get into that a bit, and then get really into the meat of probably what is bringing a lot of folks here of what is the difference between universalist and inclusive versus an anti-fascist understanding of heathenry. How are these things different? Where are they similar? Where is there overlap? But ultimately, why are these things different positions? Like, why is it necessary to even position oneself as an anti-racist or anti-fascist heathen as opposed to simply being inclusive, or to use even older terminology, which I'll get into why this terminology has its own problems, of just saying you're universalist? Which, incidentally, if you are listening to this and you're going, what does that even mean? That's already a good example of where the problems with some of the language that I'm going to get into comes from. Is some of it is very dated and very specific and no longer holds resonance to people in the immediate present. And then finally, I'll be getting into what is to be done, to use an often quoted phrase in many different works on many similar topics. And you know what? If it works, use it. So yeah, this is going to be the part where I wax eloquent about what I think should be done. And generally speaking, without, doing anything that puts people at risk or is in any way undermining these kind of efforts, broadly explaining what the best approach is from an anti-fascist perspective for dealing with this problem of racism, organized hate, white nationalism, and fascism in heathenry and other adjacent related pagan practices. And before I really dive in, just as a quick reminder, if you like what this show is doing and you support this podcast, then please pop on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer and throw in $5 a month. This small subscription fee gets you 1 week early access to all podcasts, episodes, and as the subscriber base grows, will include bonus episodes and additional bonus and early access content. So, off we go. And, of course, the best place to start, as I said before, is this whole thing about religion and politics. So, as I'm sure anyone who's grown up in any kind of white or waspy influenced household can tell you, it is practically a truism to say there are two topics you never discuss, and those are religion and politics. And that's because those, aside from various major sports franchises, are the ones that are most likely to start a serious fight with your eccentric aunt or uncle or grandparents over across the Thanksgiving table. And generally speaking, it's seen as better just to sort of let sleeping dogs lie and not get into this stuff. And this also kind of goes hand in hand with this very sort of loose tradition, particularly that we see in the United States, of a really sort of hands-off secularism that's often summarized as the idea of separation of church and state, which is to say, religion is over here, politics are over here, and these are two things that should sort of just stay in their different spaces. And this is, a nice idea, and certainly that kind of secularist pluralism would be a good thing for society to aspire to. If it were ever true at any point in history, that would be spectacular. But as anyone who has taken any amount of time to look into either of these topics can tell you, and full disclosure, this is not necessarily the thing I'm an expert in, but, it's something that anyone who cracks a history book can tell you about. This has never been the case. Religion and politics are two things that are deeply intertwined, and I'll get into briefly what the reasons are from each side in brief, because there's quite a bit to cover in this episode. And of course, some of these subtopics in this episode will probably get their own episodes at some point, so, if there's something that isn't explained with sufficient detail here, don't worry, I'll get into it more later at some point. So, from the angle of religion and various religious movements around the world, it really is kind of farcical to argue that religion should be staying out of politics and secular affairs. And this is simply because, from a religious perspective, religious and spiritual beliefs are things that are, at least in theory, all-encompassing. They offer answers and solutions to all aspects of life, whatever they are. And this doesn't necessarily mean, the Bible's going to tell you Jesus says vote Republican, though there certainly are a lot of Republicans who really genuinely wish that were the case, especially right now. You still get a pretty clear sense in different religious movements and groups around the world of what is and is not moral and right conduct, and one could then argue that if there's people who are holding positions of power, political office, and what have you, who are acting in ways that are contrary to those morals and ethics, that it is appropriate for deeply held ethical and moral reasons to speak out against this. And this is not necessarily a radical idea. Like, we can go back just in the modern period, for example, to the Quakers as one early example within Christianity of a denomination that, along with having a number of other very radical ideas about how people should be treating each other and living in society, were early opponents of slavery and advocates of abolitionism, when most of Europe and the Americas were busy going, why should we care that we are literally working people who we took at gunpoint to death in the plantations of Barbados, where, the average life expectancy of slaves taken from West Africa was less than a year. Anyone who wants to say that slavery is just history, think about that one for a minute there. And those numbers were quite similar in other American sugar plantations throughout the South, but leaving that aside, you had this group of people who were actively advocating to confront what was probably one of the biggest industries in the Atlantic world, certainly the most profitable in Europe, and was the backbone of the British colonies in the Americas, as well as essential for sustaining all the different European colonies in the Caribbean. And these were people who were met with violence and opposition for their advocacy to recognize the simple creed that the abolitionists rallied around of, am I not a fellow man and your brother? And this is far from the only example of where you have people who are using spiritual ideas and ethics as justification for taking action. Like, if we move forward to something that is a much more, closer to heathen example, there's more than a few instances that you can easily find just hopping on Google of Icelanders who, as far as I know anyway, don't explicitly identify as being heathen practitioners or anything similar, nonetheless chain themselves to boulders and block roadways and all kinds of other things that we associate with like radical environmentalism in North America to stop development in Iceland, because they feel that these different developments are being done without consulting the Alfar, who are local spirits, or also the Huddlefolk, or other entities that are associated with the land. Something that really isn't that far removed from, say, the peoples of Standing Rock, of the Lakota Nation, and many other indigenous nations of North America opposing Keystone XL. And of course, on the flip side, for anyone who's living in the United States of America, there is the religious right, who, while I would argue are advancing goals and causes that do great harm to people, nonetheless point to their spiritual interpretations and practices for justification to get involved in temporal politics, even though the Bible itself has that really famous quote about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and render unto God that which is God's. What that means, of course, is getting into its own whole can of worms, depending on who you ask. But that is an example, and it also is one that I've found tends to come to mind for a lot of inclusively minded heathens around the concept of, should my spiritual beliefs be informing how I am involving myself in the world and in secular affairs? Now, from the other angle, just briefly, there are all kinds of instances of where political regimes have actively used spirituality as a cudgel, and in some cases, a football, passed between different players in an attempt to achieve leverage over one another. Simply looking at the history of the Papacy from the Middle Ages, starting with the Fourth Lateran Council, all the way to the Reformation, shows that far from necessarily being the preeminent institution in Christendom, the bishopric of Rome was passed around, fought over, negotiated, and frequently used by whoever could exercise leverage to their particular political ends. One can even see, to look at a medieval history example, the schism of the Avignon Papacy, and you can look that up for details. It's a really interesting period in time where there were two popes who excommunicated each other, and at one point there was actually a third pope who excommunicated the other two, and the other two excommunicated him, and somewhere along the way that papal crown was bought by a pirate, so there you go, Jack Sparrow in a bishop's mitre. But, you know, leaving all that aside for a second, when you look at a map of who supported the popes in Avignon versus the popes in Rome, they happened to line up with the 100 Years' War, which was raging between England and France at the time. Of those who supported the English claims for dominion over France also happened to support the renegade papacy in Rome, whereas those who supported France's claims, including countries like Scotland, happened to support the papacy in Avignon. Funny how that works. And there's many other examples in many other religions around the world where religious institutions are used as tools for enforcing power over the population. One particular example that comes to mind would actually be Spain in the early 20th century, leading up to the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, where the Spanish Catholic Church, far from being simply a religious institution, was rather notorious for breaking the seal of confession, which was supposed to be a big no-no under canon law, to rat out suspected union and farm worker organizers to the Guardia Civil, who were, basically the Spanish national police, as it were, for arrest and prosecution, largely at the behest of major landowners who also happened to be sponsors of many of the works of the church during that period. You can even see, if you go to the Grand Mosque Cordoba in Spain, which is usually heralded as a great monument to Moorish architecture and the Islamic period in Spain, you can see, since it has since been turned into a cathedral, a plaque that has been erected glorifying the deaths of several individuals as religious martyrs for fighting, most likely on the side of fascist elements during the Spanish Civil War. Because, again, there was a close relationship between those who supported the fascist cause in Spain and those who opposed it, that tended to align with different elements within the Spanish Catholic Church. There's even, for a really notorious example, since we're going to get into the whole thing that is fascism and religion, the Reich's Concordat, which was an agreement that was reached between the Catholic Church and the Nazi government under Adolf Hitler, that effectively said to the papacy, you are going to look the other way, you are not going to say anything about what it is we're doing in Germany, and in exchange, we are going to leave you alone. We are not going to interfere in your affairs, and we are going to let you do as you will. This certainly wasn't the first time, incidentally, that particular pope would reach such an accommodation with a fascist head of state. And this little trip into history does serve a purpose when we're getting into this topic, because you'll frequently see to this day folks in various different heathen circles, web groups, pagan groups, what have you, who will say, I don't want anyone getting any politics in my religion. How dare you get that political peanut butter over in my spiritual chocolate? I do not like how these things mix together. They don't taste good to me. Keep that away from me. And as I see it, this is a position that I can see where it comes from. I can see how it's informed, especially in the United States, where you have a particular strain of Christianity that is notoriously intolerant and has a history going back to the Satanic Panic of the 1980s at the most recent of prosecuting specifically pagan-leaning religions. So it makes sense to have this kind of apolitical stance. But nonetheless, it's one that doesn't really effectively engage with that by having an answer on politics that is, we're not going to discuss this, we're not going to engage with this. What you are effectively doing is you are conceding your position to the status quo. You are saying what currently exists is all right by me, regardless of what may or may not be wrong with it. And I would argue there's a lot wrong with it. There's many who would probably disagree with that, but this is my podcast. They can go disagree in the comments section all they like. Whether or not I let the comments stay put depends on the tenor and nature of them, of course. But what I'm getting at is to argue that one should not engage in political affairs when spirituality, especially pagan and heathen forms of spirituality, is supposed to offer a completely different way of living in the world and approaching these questions of life, the universe, and everything, our relationship with the natural world, which is a topic that is especially pressing when we are facing climate catastrophe in a way that is unleashing the sixth great mass extinction. Go climate depletion there. To say that we should be keeping any kind of political discussion out of our religious spaces is to say that we're not going to engage with what's happening in the world out there. It's no different than people who shout about keeping politics out of their comic books or out of their movies or out of their video games or any of these other places where people are seeking some kind of escape or solace from the grind that is life right now. And I can understand why people want that escape, but I do not think spirituality is a place for that escape. I am very much of the school of thought that this brings the podcast then to the question of white nationalism and the heathen revival. And this is something that is a very big topic to unpack, especially since I've already said I do not believe the proportion of heathens who are genuinely fascist, white nationalist, unquestionably hoisting the banner of racial holy war is any significantly higher, at least not statistically speaking anyway, than what is present in the broader pagan community. It is simply more a question of that they are organized and visible in doing so. So, to begin, as far as the history, and this is the best place to begin because I've studied history, it's the place to go for explanations, I think, because it does provide some sense of how we got to the place we are. And this particular history is something that I've been wrestling with for many years. And this history begins in 1973. With Sveinbjorn Beinteinsson and his fellows who started Ásatrúarfélagið in Iceland in 1972. It's worth pointing out that the world of 1972 was one where American supremacy on the global stage was being challenged. The old European colonial empires were disintegrating. The civil rights movement had just recently reached a ferocious climax in terms of legal reforms as well as direct action and movements. And the oil shock, which would upend the economic relationships between the global north and global south, is only just around the corner. So this is a time of where all that is assumed to be modernity is being questioned in a lot of ways from many different directions. And with Beinteson and Asatru Felagid, this group had long been organized with clearly inclusive intent. Beinteson has been famously quoted as saying, anyone may worship the gods in whatever manner he likes. Okay, granted, we can get into gendering or whatever, but, you know, you can see the gist of what it is that he's going for there. And when you look at the other similar revivals that start popping up in the 80s and 90s in Norway and Sweden, that the general trend in these places where you could say there is the most direct contact and connection with the folklore, the source material, and everything else is one towards a sort of benign inclusivity that effectively says, hey, if you're interested in this stuff, then cool. Check it out, learn it, and we'd love to see you down at Bloat sometime. And I'd also like to say up front that this is not simply coming from a place of it's a bunch of lily white people who are saying, hey, we're cool with everybody, so please come on in. Like, Sweden in particular in this period had very generous asylum policies, which included many refugees who were fleeing from South America due to certain things like Operation Condor, Pinochet, and various American-sponsored fuckery in the continent that led to a lot of political dissidents having to seek somewhere to live that did not involve being thrown into soccer stadiums to be brutalized by dogs and secret police. And I'm not going to go into more detail because then I'll need content warnings. Go ahead, look it up. It's awful. But it's worth bringing this particular point up because these folks coming from South America also brought with them some of the different ideas and practices of the regions that came with them. And from conversations I've had with people involved in Foreign Sitters Sverige, which is the Swedish national organization, they say many of the specifics and particulars of how their mystical practices work were directly influenced by these refugees, bringing their practices and ideas with them as they were fleeing from very politically motivated brutality. So when this is the broader context for if you're going to say you're some kind of white nationalist who says that only people of Nordic descent should be allowed to practice, therefore the Nordic peoples should be the best example, that kind of runs really askew to everything that the True Folk Assembly, Stephen McNallen, and all these other various fascist organizations out there advocate. That they claim only somebody who's descended from the so-called peoples of the North should be allowed to practice and engage in these ideas and beliefs. And in fairness, these were the first groups to get organized in the United States and Canada. Before any other kind of Norse-influenced groups of any sort were popping up, just as, for example, the Covenant of the Goddess was starting to come together and Archer Act Fane was being founded in North America, is when you see Stephen McNallen bringing together the Asatru Free Assembly, and the seed crystal of his organization was based on recruiting people through Soldier of Fortune, also known as the far-right magazine for people who are, or at least pretend to be, guns for hire. And certainly had a significant crossover with lovely activities like going south of the border in the 1980s to Central America to shoot nuns in the name of fighting communism, which is its whole other thing. Go ahead, look up the Contras, Also look up Iran-Contra and the time that President Ronald Reagan committed a treason or two. But that's a topic for a different podcast, probably by a different podcaster. And as a consequence, because they were basically the first ones to lay claim to the spiritual territory of anyone in the English-speaking Americas, you see that McNallen and McNallen influenced, as well as Odinic Rite influenced, and all this other like kind of mishmash influenced ritual and practice, as well as interpretations, show up all over the place in modern heathen practice. Even the commonly accepted in many quarters practice of having the bloat horn carried by an individual designated as a Valkyrie in a fashion that's really quite similar to Christian communion is something that comes out of the Osseter Free Assembly and McNallen and his cohort. This is stuff that is further influenced by things like, you can see stuff like the Nine Noble Virtues, which was literally written by the Odinic Rite, who were started as a committee of the British Nationalist Party, or at least one of their precursors, because they felt the best way to move forward in organizing was to change the culture through creating a form of spirituality that existed specifically to advocate fascist ideas. Like, nothing better sums this up than that we can see in surviving documents that purity was supposed to be the 10th virtue, but it was dropped because the people designing the Nine Noble Virtues stopped and went, this could probably tip off anybody who's looking for obviously racist shit. So we're not going to put this in here. We're going to leave this out. And these are ideas that are, among many others, very endemic in heathenry today. You can even see to grab from an inclusive author for a minute, Diana Paxson's Essential Ossetru, the argument that one of the things that caused the Viking Age was that the people of Scandinavia were in some ways the shadow that was forced to be confronted by the Anglo-Saxons of England, who had recently converted to Christianity and effectively were facing the wrath of the gods for straying from the ways of their ancestors. To say there's not something incredibly loaded in there, though as I understand there's supposed to be an updated version of that book coming out at some point in the near future, hopefully that particular bit of really dodgy theology gets addressed. These influences are present in many places in modern heathen context, both because of the early influence that McNallen and his people played in developing American heathenry, and then because of the outsized influence, particularly care of the internet, that American culture and American media have played in influencing these broader global trends. Whether or not one actively subscribes to this kind of white nationalism, these kind of influences are there and very present from the beginning in this revival, and are something that really do have to be grappled with. Even though, based on available data, both Scotty Snook's American Heathenry, which is an absolutely brilliant piece of research that goes into the whole mess that is modern American heathenry, the Huygens Heathenhof 2016 demographic survey, as well as the widespread outright global support for Declaration 127 in denouncing the Ossetru Folk Assembly, also founded by Stephen McNallen. Yes, I know, they both have the same initials. They're still more or less going along the same ideas, but regardless, what we see as far as percentages of heathens, again, these studies and surveys do need to be taken both with a grain of salt, because there are limitations to these things, particularly because the scale and spread of paganism generally, as well as heathenism in particular, are not very well documented or recorded in any institutional fashion. So anyone who's doing this kind of survey work, always put this asterisk after what they're doing. And this is not to knock the work that anyone doing this research has done. This is more just, representing a really critical fact that anyone reading these findings should keep in mind. Even so, with all these caveats and provisos, what is seen in both these bodies of research is maybe approximately 30 to 35%, at most, if we're being generous, of heathenry as a movement in the United States, and generally, globally speaking, actively follow openly white nationalist and fascist ideas. Now, this is not getting into the other 65 to 70% and untangling all that, because there's a lot to untangle there, but it is worth pointing out that this is a percentage that's very similar to the percentage of Americans who believe the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. At least a month out from the election. Since then, Fox News and everybody else have been amplifying that, so the numbers have been distorted a bit. But it is worth pointing out that when a third of the broader population of the United States of America is completely on board with what is effectively a fascist conspiracy theory, and that number parallels with what we see in the heathen community based on available data, with caveats and provisos, of course, one could infer that the political makeup of heathenry is in many ways a reflection of the circumstances in broader society. And while there are certainly specific interpretations and applications that are different from what we see in broader society, such as, for example, one thing that is consistent with both heathenry and paganism generally is both of these communities have a much higher level of queer participation than you see in broader society, which suggests a greater degree of toleration and acceptance for these ideas than what we see in mainstream society, at least in those segments of these communities that are tolerant, inclusive, and embracing of these ideas. That there are certainly places where things diverge, and certainly around questions of things like the environment and the climate. But generally speaking, that approximately the same percentage of heathens are identifying with some kind of fascist ideology, as we're seeing generally in the United States. And, it's its own thing that 36% of Americans are on board with what is an openly fascist coup attempt. The little things. That what we're seeing in heathenry is not so much because of anything that is uniquely wrong with heathenry or anything that is specific to heathenry, though it is certainly influenced by these historical factors and the impact of people like Stephen McNallen, the Odinic Rite, Stephen Flowers, and many of these other individuals and groups, that nonetheless, this in some ways is a reflection of what we're seeing in society. And this idea of what is happening in this community as being a reflection of the broader world is something to sort of keep in mind. And I would say, put a pin in that. Make sure that's sort of firmly on your board, because I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. Because now I'm going to get more into the differences between inclusion and the anti-racist, anti-fascist responses to this reality. Now, of these two sets of ideas, the inclusive and previously known as universalist position is probably the older of the two, as far as being an organized body of thought. Universalist and inclusive ideology, and this is, again, my very brief summary of what is a significant body of thought that has been expounded across a whole variety of blog posts, newsletters, books, and as well as personal conversations and interactions, is one that effectively says there is nothing within the existing lore, from what we know of the Norse peoples, or of the period that we are drawing inspiration from that suggests there was any kind of concept of racial exclusion or any sort of like biologically driven notions of nationalism that said you are only German if you are descended from people in Germany, you are only American if you are descended from people who slaughtered the Ohlone 150 years ago and have been squatting on the land ever since, or, you know, other similar kinds of notions of nationalism and national identity. The inclusive argument further points to examples of the gods intermarrying between different groups, with Aesir marrying with Jotnar, the bringing an integration of hostages of the Vanir into the Aesir, and other similar exchanges that cross these different tribal barriers that argue that it is not only possible, but certainly acceptable for people who are from outside the so-called in-group to be brought in and welcomed into the fold, as it were. The thing with this kind of universalist and inclusive perspective is it does not, although in some places this is becoming the case, but generally speaking, there's nothing with the universalist or inclusive position that really rebuts the influences that white nationalist ideology has had on ritual forms, on ideas, on interpretations, and in some cases doesn't really effectively address the broader influence of romantic nationalism and the great age of spiritualism on the modern pagan movement, including things like the widespread presence of cultural appropriation, that these practices were themselves in many ways products of the last great age of international colonialism and imperialism, before going into, of course, the whole debate as to whether or not everything that's happened since 1945 counts as colonialism or not. I personally think it does, but I'm not going to get into that whole argument here because that's its own podcast. And there's other people that have written whole books about that. So, you know, go dig some of those up and check them out. But that generally these influences, as well as a sort of tendency towards escapist reconstruction, which is not the case of all forms of reconstruction, but one thing that is sort of a consistent problem within paganism generally, and there's a thing that is true in heathenry as well, is this tendency towards escapism and isolation from the problems of the world through basically cultivating your very special identity, your special spiritual practice, your more enlightened position, puts you sort of above these petty concerns. I mean, I'm sure that anyone who's listening to this has probably met somebody who is at least ticking a few of these boxes that I've just rattled off here. Ultimately, the thing that is really sort of the rub, and this is the place where the anti-racist and anti-fascist position disagrees with the universalist and inclusive position, is that universalism and inclusivism sort of stops at, well, if we bring in people who have been conventionally marginalized in broader society and we include them into this community on the terms of the community as it currently exists, then we will be effectively moving beyond these problems in broader society, making ourselves more diverse and inclusive, and we're good, right? Well, no. And I want to be clear that there certainly are folks who have a more nuanced position on these ideas, but that's sort of broad strokes. But to get past that disclaimer for a minute, no. The anti-racist and anti-fascist position, at least from my perspective, argues this is not sufficient. The fact is, modern paganism and modern heathenry are products of a society that, particularly when these ideas were developing and percolating and then coming into the understanding of the general population, were ones that are profoundly influenced by different white supremacist, structurally patriarchal, structurally colonial, and many of these other different ideologies and systems. And I want to emphasize systems in particular, because what we're talking about here is not just a question of ideas and perspectives. We're talking about diagnoses of how society as it currently functions operates, which goes much deeper than I have a different idea about the way people should be treated, and goes to the level of, regardless of your ideas about how people are treated, the dice are loaded to roll one way. And that one way consistently leaves very specific groups of people with nothing at the table when everything is counted and the chips have been sorted. What anti-fascism and anti-racism offers to heathenry specifically, as well as paganism generally, is the argument that it is absolutely necessary for us to question the assumptions that are passed down from otherwise flawed, in some cases, outright fascist sources of research and ideology, and to furthermore take the next step and ask, how can we construct practices that are free of these influences? Not just by repudiating them, but then going back to what we know of historical examples of pre-Christian practice, as well as parallel to Christian practice, because of course, when we're working with things like folklore, you're going to be getting into that whole kind of muddling of different sources and influences, and really asking questions of what were these peoples doing before you start seeing the introductions of similar destructive ideas like Christian feudalism, early imperialism, the introduction of the notion of different human races. What does spirituality look like when we eject these ideas? And not just eject them, but then say, what is there that fills this space when we clear it of these kind of influences, which were, without any exception, products of people seeking domination and control over others, and justification for extraction, coercion, one could even go so far as to say extortion and brutality on a global scale. And what does our practice look like when we have done that? And ultimately, the answer that does seem to be consistent so far is one that is humane, one that is centered on meeting the genuine needs of practitioners, one that truly seeks not mastery, but harmony with the natural world that modern society has cruelly sundered from us, going back as far as the first enclosures and the German peasant wars and many other similar conflicts besides. And what does this suggest for how we should be living? How we should be interacting with the institutions of society? And whether or not examples like the Ting and Alting assemblies, where in some cases even thralls were allowed to speak before the assembly and vote in their own blocks, as is described in the Vita Libwini, an account of a missionary in 8th century Saxony, what is now northern Germany. What does this suggest for what our spirituality should look like? How it should be interacting with the world? What it should be doing? And most importantly, how we should be responding to the question of fascism and white nationalism in this community. Which brings this discussion to what is to be done. And the answer is very directly, organize overtly anti-racist and anti-fascist community. Don't simply stop at the place of all are welcome and those who preach bigotry and hatred have no place here. Take it to the next level and say loudly and proudly, we welcome all and we oppose all who would use our spirituality or any other means to marginalize peoples based on what is essentially part of who they are, whether that is who they love, how they identify, what segment of society they were born into, or most importantly, whatever significance has been applied by institutions of power to the color of their skin or national origin. And I think that this kind of a bold stance of not just simply saying we will welcome all, but to say, and we also stand against these forces within our community and the world, is fundamentally necessary. If, as I've established earlier in this podcast, one accepts that the existence of white nationalist elements in heathenry is a reflection of broader society, then any solution to white nationalism and heathenry must include confronting and defeating these forces in broader society. It is not enough to simply say, we have done our bit and we do not allow these things into this particular space, when there are people within our spiritual practice who will not respect such boundaries, when there are people who are outside of this practice, who have really no knowledge of it whatsoever, who will gladly seize the aesthetics of the pre-Christian Scandinavian world to justify the kind of brutality that we've seen from people like Dylan Roof, or the butcher at Christchurch, or the murderer at the Tree of Life Synagogue, or the individual labeled as the QAnon shaman by media in the US Capitol building. It does not matter if we have made this bold statement of we don't allow that inside this space, when people are actively taking up the symbols and ideas we draw inspiration from and are using them as weapons to brutalize people outside of those spaces. We cannot rest until these influences have been expunged as thoroughly as possible. And this calls for organizing communities who directly and openly identify not just as inclusive, but as anti-racist and anti-fascist, who assert that there will be no compromise with bigotry. There will be no compromise with the enablers of the despoiling and destruction of the earth and the peoples who live upon it. There will be no compromise with those who seek to use a faith whose one agreed on tenet, cattle die, kinsmen die, and so dies oneself. But one thing I know never dies is the fame of a dead man's deeds, as instruments for ideologies whose soil, whose fruit and roots are everything but in alignment with the spirit and letter of those words. This is why I believe the anti-fascist and anti-racist solution must be one of critical examination of how we as a community organize and operate, of cultivating ritual and spiritual practice that is truly participatory and brings people in as much as possible, and encourages taking action in the name of the moral and ethical truths that we hold dear. This action can range from something as simple as organizing an anti-racist fellowship to engaging in many different forms of direct action. Whatever it is you do is your choice. But regardless, I believe we must go beyond the simple inclusive position and clearly assert that this struggle is also our struggle, and we will stand in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, with all who face these same dragons. And hopefully, someday, together, we will overcome. The alternative, as history has shown, is simply too awful to contemplate.